How's it going, everyone? Today I want to talk about the history of Nintendo handheld systems, since Nintendo is the champion of handheld and always has been for 40 plus years. In 1980, Nintendo in Japan had success with their home video game consoles in Japan, the Color TV games, which came out in different models with different games, like a racing one or a version of Breakout, but most notably Pong. But one day, as Gunpei Yokoi, who was a talented designer at Nintendo, saw a Japanese businessman playing with a calculator, he had an idea to make a handheld game system that you could bring on the go, and also doubled as a watch and could tell time. So he started working on it, and then the Game & Watch was made. They were handheld systems with LCD screens, much like on an analog clock. It can play one game and could tell the time, hence the name being Game & Watch. The Game & Watch systems were so popular in Japan, Nintendo released a ton of different models of the Game & Watches, and they even sold them in America as well. With Nintendo's success of their arcade game Donkey Kong, they made a Donkey Kong Game & Watch, which had two LCD screens and even had a new way to control games, the D-pad, in which Gunpei Yokoi invented as an easier way to play games. Also, the Donkey Kong Game & Watch has the inspiration for the design of the DS, which released 20 years later in 2004. The Game & Watch systems were discontinued in 1991, with the final Game & Watch system being Mario the Juggler, which was a Mario version of the iconic Game & Watch ball, which sold quite well. In the end, the Game & Watch systems are so well known in the retro gaming community. Mr. Game & Watch is a playable fighter in Super Smash Bros., and even Nintendo released a Game & Watch systems for Mario and Zelda's 35th anniversaries back in 2020 and 2021. After that, in 1989, Nintendo released the Game Boy, which just so happened to also been made by Gunpei Yokoi, the same guy who made all the other systems. The NES was increasing in popularity in the US after saving the gaming industry. But in 1989, the Game Boy was released and was revolutionary. It allowed you to take great games like Super Mario Land, the first portable Mario platformer, and many more great games, like the first Pokemon games, which released a bunch of years later. But the crazy thing was that you can change out the game cartridges, also known as game packs, and play different games, all without having to buy new system models, like the Game & Watch, which was super incredible. Although the screen wasn't backlit and it was lacking in terms of power and screen capability, after its rival at the time, the Sega Game Gear, was a wide layout with a backlit color screen. Although the Game Gear was more powerful than the Game Boy still won the war, because it may have had a spinach color screen, but the battery life was so much longer and better than the Game Gear's screen, and also had great Nintendo exclusives, which you cannot play anywhere else. Also, the Game Boy started at a price of just $89.99, $90. It also included a free copy of Tetris, which went on to be the most popular and well-known puzzle games of all time. It's also a really good game. In 1996, Nintendo released a smaller, more compact Game Boy with the Game Boy Pocket, which used two AAA batteries and was smaller and was $20 cheaper than the other models, but still played games all the same. Then, in 1998, exclusively in Japan, Nintendo released the Game Boy Lite, which was a backlit Game Boy Pocket, and it was the first ever backlit system Nintendo ever made. But then Nintendo went back to no backlit screens in late 1998 with the release of the Game Boy Color, which at launch retailed for $80, which was very good because it was a bit bigger than the Pocket, but roughly the same size, and had color screen. It also had updated versions of past Game Boy titles, but upgraded with color, like Link's Awakening got a DX version in color, and new Game Boy Color games came out, like Super Mario Bros. Deluxe, which was Super Mario Bros., but on the go. It had new features like a mode where you race a Boo, and even had a world map. But 1998 saw the rise of the biggest and highest grossing media franchises in the world, Pokemon, which was developed by Game Freak, but published by Nintendo. And Red and Blue sold incredibly well, and Pokemania began. They even made spin-offs on the Nintendo 64, like Pokemon Stadium, which also let you pop in your Game Boy cartridge to the N64 controller via the N64 transfer pack. They also made Pokemon Gold and Silver for the Game Boy Color in 2000, which sold incredibly well too, and introduced a new region as well as new Pokemon. In 2001, Nintendo released the Game Boy Advance, which had a 32-bit CPU and could run some amazing games. The only mainline Mario games were ports of the SNES and NES games, starting with Super Mario Advance, Super Mario Bros. 2. which they did Super Mario Bros. 2 first because of Super Mario Bros. Deluxe was already a port of the first game on the Game Boy Color. Then Super Mario Advance 2 was Super Mario World, with Super Mario Advance 3 being Yoshi's Island, and Super Mario Advance 4 being Super Mario Bros. 3. I know, the names are really messed up on those games. The GBA was also very similar to the GameCube, since it has an indigo color with gray accents. Same with the GameCube, there was even a Game Boy to GameCube link cable, which allowed you to interact with games with cool features you could only access with that link cable. It was prominently used in games like The Legend of Zelda 4 Swords Adventures. Even the GBA had a port of A Link to the Past with 4 Swords built in, which is what you need to play the 4 Swords game on the GameCube. The GBA also had its own games, starting with Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire in 2003, and even remakes of Red and Green, with Fire Red and Leaf Green a year later in 2004. Games like Pokemon Box, Pokemon Coliseum, and more Pokemon games on the GameCube could also interact with the Game Boy Advance if you had that link cable. But the GBA only had one problem. It was $100, which is a very good price for it, but the problem was that it didn't have a backlight screen, and it was still quite dim, so you had to play it under certain light to see the screen well. But in 2003, Nintendo made the greatest Game Boy of all time, the Game Boy Advance SP. The SP means special. It had a long-lasting battery life since it had a rechargeable battery, which was a first for Nintendo systems and handheld systems as a whole. It also had a clamshell design which protected the screen from scratches. Also, it made it more compact and portable. It also had a backlit screen with a button to turn the backlight off, and it was the same price as the original Game Boy Advance at $100. It even played original Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, much like the regular GBA. The GBA line of systems ended up selling 81 million units, 20 million less than the original Game Boy, which sold exceedingly well at 100 million units. But that 81 million units of the GBA line of systems were taken off by the 1 million Game Boy Micro systems sold, releasing in 2005, a year after the DS. Nintendo released the Game Boy Micro for the same price as the other models, at $100. It has a 2-inch screen, which is very tiny, and the whole system sold so poorly because of the small screen size, the fact that it could not play original Game Boy games, and was really gimmicky as a whole. But even worse than that is the Virtual Boy, which Nintendo classifies as a handheld system, released in 1995, a year before the N64. The Virtual Boy launched at a price of $180, but the real reason this system only sold 770,000 units was because of the whole system's power. It was 32-bit 3D gaming with a backlit screen and used batteries, but the major downside was the fact that it only played games in red and black, and gave people headaches, so it wasn't really good to play for a long amount of time. It came with a free copy of Mario Tennis, which was a cool way to see the system's features, only if it wasn't for the eye-piercing red and black screen. Then this system probably would have sold a lot better, and it only had a total of 17 games, which didn't help it either. I don't really classify it as a handheld system because it isn't really a handheld system and more of a tabletop system, since it also doesn't have a head strap, much like newer virtual reality consoles have. Also, the batteries for the system go in the controller. Although there is an AC adapter, they sold separately. After, in 2004, Nintendo released a new handheld system, the Nintendo DS, which stood for Developer System, which was because it was easy to develop games for, probably why there's so much shovelware on it, and also it stood for Dual Screen, which was the whole gimmick. It looks a lot like the Donkey Kong Game & Watch from 20 years earlier, but the DS is way more high-tech than a Game & Watch. It has a D-pad, 4 face buttons, L and R bumpers, a stylus, interchangeable game cartridges, 2 3-inch backlit screens. The bottom and top screen were the same, but the bottom screen was a touchscreen. It had a port for GBA cartridges for backwards compatibility, although original Game Boy games were incompatible. And the system retailed for $150 and launched with a port of Super Mario 64 for the DS, called Super Mario 64 DS. It's much like the GBA port, but with new features, like looking better than the blockier N64 release, a map on the bottom screen, and 30 more stars, making the total number of stars 150. It even proved L was real 24/1, because Luigi was playable as well as Yoshi and Wario. It even has DS download play battle mode. I personally prefer the N64 version, but this version also is really cool as well. In 2006, Nintendo released a slimmer, more sleeker version of the DS called the DS Lite. It was way slimmer, which added for more portability, and it played games the same as the original fat model. It also had a slightly larger screen. It also had a GBA slot, but the game stuck out a little. This model is what made the DS sell so well, costing only $130, being Nintendo's best-selling handheld system, but all the digital features it had were also great. It had a built-in clock and calendar, DS Download Play, allowed for games to be played and shared, even if a friend didn't have the game cartridge. Even PictoChat, which is a Super Smash Bros. Stage, also a texting service, but you didn't have to pay for it. It allowed users to talk to their friends. Also, the DS was the first ever system Nintendo made to have internet compatibility. In 2009, Nintendo made a console refresh with the DSi. It ditched the GBA backwards compatibility for an internet browser and had a new home menu. The system also had a front and back facing digital camera, a slightly larger screens than that of the DS Lite, and costed $170. It had amazing features and its own digital shop like the Wii Shop channel with the DSi shop. You could download some DSiWare games, much like WiiWare games. This system also had Flipnote, which allowed for you to make little animations, which is still used today. Then in 2010, Nintendo made the fourth DS system with the DSi XL, which is considered to be the best DS model ever. It launched at a price of $190, then dropped to $170, and then in 2012 reduced to $130. It mainly is larger with larger screens, with a size of 4.2 inches, which is way better than any other screen on any other handheld at the time. The DS in total sold 155 million units, making it the highest-selling handheld ever outside the Switch, which is more of a hybrid console. Then in March of 2011, Nintendo released the long-awaited successor to the DS with the 3DS, which introduced glasses-free 3D gaming, other than the Virtual Boy, but that is not really a great system. It had a wider top screen than the DS, but with the bottom screen about the same size as the DSi screens. It launched for $250, which is a lot, but then was reduced to only $170. For those who bought the 3DS at launch for the $250, were rewarded with the Ambassador program, which gave them 10 free NES and GBA games, which are the only way to play GBA games on the 3DS, and even an Ambassador certificate. Now you can find an Ambassador 3DS for a lot of money on eBay, since 3DS prices have skyrocketed in the last few years. Then in 2012, for $200, the 3DS XL released and was like the DSi XL, with larger screens, this time being 4.88 inches, and a bottom screen that was only 4.18 inches. Then in 2013, Nintendo made the 2DS, which was a cheaper alternative to the 3DS, but without any 3D features. It can still play all 3DS games just fine, but in 2D. It also dropped the clamshell closing functionality, making the screens more prone to scratches. Also, I think it removed closing functionality to lower the cost of making two different screens, since the 2DS actually just has one big screen, but it is made to look like they are two different screens. It launched at $130, then dropped to $100 in 2015, then $80 permanently in 2016. In fact, my first ever video game system I ever owned was a blue 2DS, which came bundled with Mario Kart 7. Which also happens to be the first ever video game I played, ever. The 2DS's screens were also the same size as the original 3DS's screens, but in February of 2015, Nintendo dropped the new Nintendo 3DS XL, which was a more powerful 3DS with more power, the same screen size as the original 3DS's XL screens, but it also added NFC support in the bottom, allowing for amiibos to be scanned in. It also had a C-stick, or nub, which could allow for camera control in compatible games. The new 3DS XL also had a face tracking 3D feature, which made it so that the 3D doesn't look weird when you tilt the system to the side. It retailed for $200 and was the best 3DS to buy, and it still is to this day. It even has its own exclusives like Minecraft New Nintendo 3DS Edition, which does lag a bit when mining, but it is a cool way to take Minecraft on the go. It also has a Xenoblade port, although it looks worse than the Wii's version, since the new 3DS didn't make the graphics better. It was still locked at 240p compared to the Wii's 480p. And there's new exclusives as well. The new 3DS also launched in America with the XL version, but later in 2015, Nintendo started releasing the regular size new 3DS with screens the same size as the original 3DS and 2DS, but with the same power as the new 3DS XL. You can also get swappable faceplates, which came in different colors, or Mario Maker plates, or Animal Crossing plates, and many more different plates you can buy. Also, the new models have micro SD card support rather than regular SD cards, and the other models took. In 2017, Nintendo released the Nintendo Switch. After the failure of the Wii U, after it only sold 13 million units compared to the Wii's 101 million units, and the 3DS's somewhat success, after it sold 75 million units across all the models, the Nintendo Switch and the Wii U were bundled into one, making the world's first hybrid console. You can play in 1080p on the TV by putting the system into the dock, or you can take the system out of the dock and play in handheld mode in 720p. And even you can pull out the kickstand to play in tabletop mode by detaching the Joy-Cons, which can also be held horizontally to allow for two-player games. And so far, the Nintendo Switch has just recently surpassed the original DS in terms of sales, making it the highest-selling Nintendo console of all time. And is almost going to beat the PS2 in sales and hopefully become the best-selling video game console of all time. The Switch has sold so well because it started at a price of $300, but was more recently raised to $350. But in July of 2017, a few months after the Switch released and was selling well, the final 3DS model was released, the new Nintendo 2DS XL. Bundled all the great things about the new 3DS, the enhanced processing power, C-Nub, bigger screens, microSD cards, and more, and put it into the body of the 2DS, this time with a clamshell design, and costed $150 at launch. The 3DS family of systems was continued in 2020 because the Switch was selling so well, and the final game Nintendo released for the 3DS was Mario & Luigi Bowser's Inside Story plus Bowser's Jr.'s Journey, which is the remake of the DS Mario & Luigi game. In 2019, Nintendo released the Nintendo Switch Lite, which removed TV mode support and detachable Joy-Cons, and launched at $200, which is $100 cheaper than the base Switch, but the Switch Lite is now $230 with the Switch's new price of $350. In 2021, there were lots of rumors that Nintendo was going to make a Nintendo Switch Pro, which would have been 4K support, but those rumors turned to be false when the Nintendo Switch OLED model released in 2021. It was the same power as a base Switch, no graphical upgrades, and no new enhanced power. It was still 1080p docked and 720p handheld, but this time with a 7-inch handheld screen, which was also OLED, making the handheld blacks pop more on the screen. The base Switch had 6-inch screen, the Lite had 5.5-inch screens. The OLED model's dock also has a LAN port, allowing for wired internet, and has a better design. The OLED model launched at $350 but is now $400, $50 less than a Switch 2, which is insane. But now that brings us to the Switch 2, Nintendo's latest handheld console hybrid, which is the most controversial Nintendo console, mainly because of the prices. The Switch 2 launched at $450, with Mario Kart World Bundle being $500. But the Switch 2 is much better than the original Switch, by a lot, since it is backwards compatible with all Switch 1 games, physical and digital, it has 4K dock support, 1080p handheld. Although the handheld screen isn't OLED, they'll probably make an OLED model in a few years, handheld screen is 7.9 inches, which is really good. Joy-Cons are a lot better. Mine don't have stick drift like my old Joy-Cons did, but stick drift has been reported on these new Joy-Cons. But they now attach on from the sides with magnets, and is a much better system, and is worth all $450. But I still feel like people should buy the original Switch, since it still needs to surpass the PS2. Anyways, hopefully Nintendo will make a new handheld console to go along with the next system, or hopefully the Switch 2. And I hope you all catch the next video, so I'll see you in the next one.